Welcome, everyone. This is sort of historic because it's our first Art and Research Center return to an in-person program since COVID. My name is Donna Honarpiche, and I'm the Assistant Curator of the Art and Research Center. And I'm excited to welcome you all here today. But before introducing our speaker, I want to announce a couple of events that we have in the next couple of weeks. So tomorrow, we have Professor Michael Tausig, who's also going to be giving a lecture in this room at 7 p.m. And then next week, we have another lecture with Professor Edgar Garcia on Wednesday, and the following week, a performance with Raven Chacon. So we've been doing a lot of programming here at the Art and Research Center, one of which I'm excited to announce, which is the launch of our new podcast, Tomorrow is the Problem, which I'm the host of. So if you get a chance, go listen to it on Spotify, Google, Apple, wherever you find podcasts. And all of these programs, these talks, seminars, as well as our digital initiatives are funded by the Knight Foundation. So I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today. This session on spirit possession is a week-long seminar series that we've been doing with Stefania Pandolfo and Michael Tausig. But Stefania Pandolfo is a professor of anthropology at UC-Berkeley, and she has been my mentor and teacher and friend now for many years, so I'm very excited to have her here. Her work centers theories of the psyche, the soul, and the imagination, as well as experience of madness in the wake of histories of post-colonial violence or destruction. Her work is at the intersection of psychoanalysis, critical theory, and Islamic cosmologies. She's written two incredible books, Impasse of the Angels, Scenes from a Moroccan Space of Memory, and Knot of the Soul, Madness, Psychoanalysis, and Islam. I'm incredibly grateful to have her here today. I'm so glad that you all are here, and please give me a hand in welcoming Stefania. Thank you.
So thank you for being here, and this is today was the last day of the seminar on possession that Michael Tausig and I on morning and afternoon ran at the institute, and it's a kind of it was a very intense experience. I will say something about it when I speak, but I first of all wanted to thank everybody, and I wanted to thank Donna and Jean and the staff at ICI, and I wanted to thank the participants to the seminar who have been quite extraordinary. So my talk is entitled Things We Call Visions, which is a quote from a book, this book, Journeys to Mount Tamalpais, which is a long prose poem by the Lebanese poet and painter who became much more famous in the end as a visual artist, but has been an extraordinary poet for her entire life. And it's a book that I will be talking about a little bit later. And it's a quote that is drawn, you know, the whole sentence says, I found an Indian cave which has rock paintings, but there is much more than color and line, high energies of the mind, things we call visions. What is vision? In what sense can the dream awaken? An aesthetic experience be, quote, one of the names that we give to our need for a breakthrough. And again, this is a quote from Etel Adnan. In the midst of a history of destruction, intimate, political, and cosmic. Through an encounter with the artwork of Lebanese painter and poet Etel Adnan, at once meditative and engaged with the devastation of war, marked by an exile from language and from home, and yet steeped in the Islamic mystical tradition, and in conversation with a novel written at the time of the Algerian War, and with a story from my own ethnography of visionary expression and traumatic experience, in today's Morocco, I will attempt to carve a space for an approach to imagination and vision where the figure, the dream, the painting, and the poem are understood as autonomous manifestations having a life of their own and agentic expressions, expressions that have a capacity of their own, as passageways, bridges that may carry us beyond the boundaries of the visible and the invisible, the living and the dead, granting us an access to, quote, another side of things. And that is a quote from the Algerian novel that I will be talking about. Or we could say, an otherwise. So this is the last day of a workshop that Michael Tossig and I have run here at ICI, organized by Donna and Jean. As I said earlier, I want to thank them. And particularly thank the participants to the workshop who have truly immersed themselves into the readings and the reflections and the fabulations around the question of possession. In the portion of the seminar that I have led every morning for 3 days, we have touched on themes that have been important in my own work, past and future, and which I am presently reflecting upon in the process of writing a book that is tentatively entitled Art Cure. We addressed the question of possession from the perspective of affliction and in relation to a practice of art, which we have explored together as a modality of mediumship, reflecting on the capacity of spirits, spirit entities, and aesthetic forms, and the parallel between art and spirit possession, and between spirits and forms, and aesthetic experience, to enable spaces of healing for persons and collectivities in the confrontation with trauma and historical rupture, and in the experience of mental pain. Entertaining the thought that in their inceptions, aesthetic forms may be bound to primary affects and to the experience of trauma and of violence itself, a wound which is at once a cut and an opening. My presentation today is in 3 parts. The first reflects on the encounter, what I call the real of war, through a leap or a passage into a mythological space. In conversation with a novel by the Algerian writer Mohamed Dib, a novel that was written in 1962, published in the year of the independence of Algeria, but that was written throughout the violence of the Algerian War. The second part moves to my ethnography in Morocco and the visionary mural paintings of a man who, in the midst of psychopathological states, altered states, mad states, paints visions of which he is the recipient, and then, in the aftermath, looks back at them, interpreting them with me, and reflecting on their symbolic forms, and on the way in which they are bridges, as he calls them, passages between related and yet incommensurable worlds, different worlds, the visible world, the invisible world, the world of his delusions and the world of everyday life, the world of the divine and the world of everyday reality. And the third and final part and longer part of my paper engages the artistic practice of Etel Adnan, her practice of what she called perception, and mediumistic ways in which her art became capable of encountering the violence of the real. So the first part is entitled Pebbles. Words renounced their status as living speech and changed into something that resembled pebbles. And that's a quote from Mohamed Dib, and I continue with a quote, "Beneath the words that were spoken, a silence made of basalt solidified everywhere without a breach or a fissure. You could sense it. You could touch it. Then the walls shifted and took up positions all around us, ignoring their former alignment, but now without observing what I can only call a general design consisting of a deliberate attempt to envelop at once the inside and the outside." This was due to the fact that the city had drowned, buried in basalt, clad into layers of rubblestone. One consequence was that words renounced their status as speech and changed into something that resembled pebbles. The voice became a useless faculty. During these times, the walls were constantly tying themselves into inextricable knots, mindless of what became of their captive. My gullet was no longer capable of forming sounds, only stones. I was ready to vomit a torrent of stones. The unnamed narrator of Who Remembers the Sea, published in 1962, written in French during the Algerian War of Independence, in the aftermath of massacres by the French army, and in the everyday claustrophobia of colonial occupation, wanders the maze of an elusive city where all reference points have become aleatory, incessantly shifting and changing shape, where reality as we know it has retreated, and with it the materiality of human bodies, our bodies, and the simple feeling of being alive, here and now, bearing a name and a memory. The city is shattered by explosions that wipe out all surrounding life, and yet remain unacknowledged by many of its inhabitants, as if nothing was happening. The world is destroyed, but people don't notice it, unable to perceive the radical strangeness of the catastrophe which is upon them. Scenes of uncanniness side by side with quotidian comings and goings, as if the novel were moving between alternate or adjoining visions of reality. The city streets and skies are patrolled by entities with mythological and imaginary names. Minotaurs, the Minotaur is the kind of the mythological Greek figure, the Spirovirs, Irias, and these are invented names and invented kind of chimeras, half animal, half human, half machine, half organic life, which terrorize its inhabitants and are nonetheless an everyday presence, as are the killings and the disappearances. We encounter mummies at street corners, and passerbys are hijacked from their reality and bodily consistency, and they're reduced to their flat outline, a kind of silhouette or a double, which then materializes into a statue. This is the dominion of inert matter, which, quote, will seize also your form. And at some point, this happens also to the narrator. Animated, so it is, life is drawn out of things, and things are turned into inert matter. And there is more life in things than in alive beings. Animated by an autonomous agency, the walls of the buildings move and realign in new forms, trapping their captive dwellers, alongside what in the novel is called the new constructions, that sprout like mushrooms during the night, forming virtual neighborhood and colonies, and increasingly suffocating all living space. It is a random movement, and yet we are told one that is driven by an unknown logic. Quote, seeking to encircle and envelope from the outside as well as from the inside. So it's a logic that exists in a kind of topological space where the inside folds into the outside and they are impossible to separate. Inside and outside of the city, but also, we are told, of our heads, because all this is also happening in our internal world and in the world at large, the external world, the world of the psyche, and as well in the world of the psyche and the world of the soul. Nafs in Arabic, the soul. And the two realms are indiscernibly entangled and superimposed with each other. Outside space, the city; inside space, the psyche; spiritual space, the soul. And we don't know whether in which one we are dwelling. Quote, I feel the corridors and underground passages that crisscross the inside of my head. From time to time, nervous discharges pass through me. Quote, and then quote again, are we at present more than a maze inside another maze? Clad into layers of basalt, the city is petrified, and all manifestations of life can only take place through the displacement of rock formation. Quote, I wanted to speak, but my voice melted into stone. Vomiting torrents of stone. Pebbles explode and release the cry trapped inside it. As for me, says the protagonist, I am happy to enclose myself in stone, for it is the best way to fight such a space of death. End of quote. And the narrator says also that we're living in a simulation of reality. We are traversing a simulation of reality in which external objects are more real than we are. From its former horizontal layout, the city transforms into a vertical structure that reaches into the underground, a kind of inverted universe, an inverted cosmos, where a network of tunnels and passageways connects the layers. For those who have ears to hear and feelers to feel, sounds can be heard from below. Hammerings and knockings, communications without words and voice, which take the form of a haptic displacement from another space-time, from outside of space and time. We may describe them as pathos forms or dynamograms, with the words of Abi Warburg, the early 20th century German art historian, who spoke about energetic transfers through memory and the transmission of history through the energy of forms, which he understood, which he called dynamograms. They're echoes of another scene, of a world beyond, as it is registered inside my own body and inside my head. The underground city, impossible to access unless one is summoned to it. One has to be called to be able to enter it. It's not given to everyone to go there. The underground city whose existence can only be dreamed and whose knowledge, the narrator supposes, is guarded by a close-knit network of feminine figures. One woman in particular, Nafisa, at once close and inaccessible, whose name in Arabic evokes the nafs, the soul, inscribing the catastrophe of the city into its scene of the soul. So there is another dimension, which is a spiritual dimension of this story, which is not exactly an allegory because it's too close to our experience, dystopic reality, to actually be an allegory. In such a shifting of the coordinates of the world, it is not just a matter of the outside occupying the inside, as we would say when we talk about the experience of trauma. There is an impact from the outside that is intrusive in relation to the inside. Rather, the narrator tells us, we're witnessing, quote, the opening of an invisible wound, a chasm opened all the way to the center of the earth, to the center of the world, end of quote. A kind of black hole, which little by little, item by item, is, he says, absorbing the entire creation. It is an astrophysical and eschatological reckoning, eschatological in the sense of world ending and the way in which world ending is talked about in religious traditions, where Mohammed Dib, the writer, describes, I say this in part because Dib, the writer, uses the term creation, and the term creation sends us back to a Quranic vision of life and death as a journey of the soul. And so that the black hole in which the city is sucked is also perhaps a different kind of event, which is an event that has spiritual significance. The sea, la mer in French, which is pronounced in French as la mer, which also means the mother with a different spelling, once touched the city just outside the city gates, but has now retreated, withdrawn into the depths of the underground, below the layers of basalt. It reappears sometimes accompanied by the humming of a non-human voice, a voice at the limit of sound, which Dib, the writer, describes as an ultrasound which defies the laws of harmony. An auspicious apparition, but one that it also announces a disaster to come, when the sea will return, washing everything into its waters, an apocalypse which is also, perhaps, a new creation. In the postface to his novel, which, I repeat, was written during the Algerian War, Mohammed Dib reflects on the impossibility of reckoning with the events of the war, as well as other wars, the Algerian War, as well as of other wars. He says, he cites, for instance, the abominations of the last World War, the atomic bomb, the monstrosity of concentration camps. And so he talks about the impossibility of reckoning with those in the mode of a realistic or naturalistic writing. The usual writing, he calls it, or the commonly used style of the novel. In the Algerian context, the war is the French military occupation, genocidal suppression, and systematic destruction. The colonial war that Frantz Fanon had described as a pitiless atmosphere and a purveyor of psychiatric illness, as well, and Fanon had actually talked about this even in the context of the revolutionary struggle itself. Dib, who had mostly written realistic novels up to that point, and vivid descriptions of agrarian life, acknowledged the felt urge to explore l'autre versant des choses, what he calls the other side of things, through a necessary, quote, leap to myth, which is his term, a passage to an intermediate imaginal realm, where it would become possible to visualize and think the unnameable, the nightmares that haunt us, lending them a face. It was an attempt at exploring the other side of things and the coming to the fore of this other side in the narrative, which we see through the concreteness of the basalt, the underground, the explosions, the electroshocks through one's head, in a kind of torsion of the narrative, so that we just move a little bit and we see things from another perspective, one that becomes radically uncanny. Taking inspiration from what he calls the method of Picasso, Pablo Picasso's painting of the Guernica massacre in 1937, and Picasso's own mythological forms, Dib writes that he attempted to dress into a form the visions, songe is the word that he uses in French, which is kind of apparitions, and the deliria that a person and a collectivity harbors within itself without knowledge and in the mode of a haunting. Just as Picasso, the painter, had relied on figural expressions to name something that has no name, the novel, Who Remembers the Sea, Dib said, sought to visualize an oniric, a dreamlike, nightmare-like landscape and respond to the imperative of giving birth to dreams. And this is his phrase. In French is accoucher de rêve. Accoucher is what a woman's body does when she has a baby. So giving birth in the literal sense of giving birth to dreams. Mediating a confrontation with the impossible through a writing of the disaster, hereby enabling a collectivity, its community to dream and to think again. For, he writes, dream forms are the sole projectors in the literal sense, is using that. He's thinking, projecting films or projecting dreams. So they're the sole projectors that can mediate an encounter with the abyss. And he says that the other side of things that he has wanted to explore resembles strongly the marriage of paradise and hell that William Blake has been talking about in his own poetry, and that this allows him to show at the same time, almost in the same image, a dream vision, which is also an apocalyptic vision. And so it is only in the mode of myth that this is possible. And a myth is not just the recurse to form that exists, but it is the production of forms, the metamorphosis of bodies, the sort of the shifting from one realm of reality to another realm in which those images, apparitions, are actually more real than the alienated reality in which people are living. I meant to have an image of Guernica, but I assume you have seen it. So, and I don't have it. So I now move to the, oh, but I have this is the book that I have been talking about. And there is an English translation. I now want to move to the second part of my talk, where I want to relate, or I want to reflect on this idea of giving birth to dreams that the Algerian writer is talking about in terms of my own work, and not exactly my own work as an anthropologist, which is a work of listening more than a work of, and a work of listening and a work of writing more than a work of making images. Even though I make images through writing, I write scenes, and maybe those scenes do have something in common with those visionary experiences. But I want to talk here about this, what I've called the leap to myth in the novel, and what does it mean to give birth to dream through the images that were given birth by a man who, in my last book, I call Ilyas, is not his real name, in Morocco, who in his altered states, and when he underwent experiences of psychosis, even though he was never diagnosed in a hospital, so it is not exactly fair to say that those are experiences of psychosis, because they only have that name within an institutional setting. And so I called them altered states. He called them hala. a state, a condition, an altered state, a word that sort of crisscrosses both the medical tradition and the spiritual tradition, and in Arabic can be sort of played between the two traditions. And I want to talk about this image, which is an image that was shown to me in 2005, first by Ilyas's life companion, a woman I called Samia, in my book, and then by Ilyas himself. And it's an image that is located in a poor neighborhood of the city of Rabat, in a very poor neighborhood that used to be a shanty town and then has become has been solidified by building the buildings, but the space has remained the same. And there is a, in one of those buildings, through stairs that go to the third floor, one comes all the way to the roof, where there are some plants, and then there was, because now it looks different, there was a room, and entering the room, this is what one saw. And so, this serpent, which is an apparition that Ilyas told me upon his return to a kind of everyday communication with other people, upon his exit from the condition, from the altered state in which he was, he told me that this is an image that he made when he did not have any consciousness of making it. It's a vision that came out of him upon his return from a time when he was wandering throughout the countryside in a mad state without awareness of what was going on, and eventually came back home in a melancholy state and locked himself inside, and he wanted to commit suicide until this image came to him. And it came to him without knowledge. It describes the coming of the image as something taking the colors and the paint that he had at his house and throwing, this is the word that he used, the image on the wall. And then he commented to me that the image came ready-made. It was already formed when he threw it on the wall. He did not exactly made it. It was not him who made it. The image came by itself, but it was the intermediary of its production. It was the medium of its production. This image he understands as a materialization, as a visionary materialization of his illness, of what he calls the torment of life, but is also a materialization of the possibility of the cure. And in fact, you see there is a little bed underneath the picture, underneath on the wall underneath the picture, and that's where he slept. And he slept there because the picture protected him. Even though he was laughing, talking to me, he said I would be afraid of the serpent, but the serpent for him was a protection. It made it possible for him to finally go to sleep. And so days later, and then for many years, we discussed this image, and he sort of deciphered it for me as one would decipher or recount one's dream upon waking up. When we dream and we wake up, the dream comes in fragments. We're not inside the experience anymore. We have a story that we can tell, but we have to go through its images to reconstruct it. And this is what Ilyas was doing. And so in going through the image to reconstruct it, he told me to read the signs, to read the symbols in this picture. And so he told me to pay attention to the sword and to the inscription, which is to the left of the sword in Arabic, which says, La ghaliba illallah in Arabic, which means only God is victorious over the illness, in other words. And then to pay attention to the crosses, to pay attention to the key, the arm with the key, to pay attention to the chain, and to pay attention to all of the other details, the horns, and the texture of this strange animal that is not exactly a snake because it looks like a fish, but it also looks like a dragon. And so he kind of laughed and said, this is somewhat of a science fiction figure that compiles, elements from different worlds. And yet it resembled the snake that in the Quran, in Islam, would appear in the grave of the person immediately upon death. And yet it's not that snake because it has horns. It looks like a dragon. And then eventually he told me that it looks like the dragon of the Christian apocalypse. So we actually have two religious traditions that are condensed into this image. And this is, oh, okay, I don't have that slide. It doesn't matter. I will tell you what he said. So he told me, so he said, if you pay attention to the image, you will see the inscription that God only is victorious, that says that only God is sovereign over all things. And then you will see the chains and the key, and he calls it the shape of imprisonment. The shape of imprisonment, and he uses the word shkil in Arabic, which is a word that pertains to the vocabulary of the plastic arts. It's shkil of imprisonment. The shape of imprisonment means it is the form of imprisonment in the way in which a painter would use that form. And then he says, he explains the horns, he explains the eyes, he explains the snake, and then he concludes that it is the torment of life. And then he says, this is the ta'bir, the expression. This is the symbolic vocabulary that I've used in my painting. And so then when we go on reflecting, and the other thing that is important to talk about in the context of this image is that, as you can see to the left, the image is partly whitewashed, so that there were other images there, but they have been wiped out. They have been erased, as if when he comes back from his altered state, he can no longer be in the presence of these images. And you see it better here, where you have a wall that has been decorated but also erased. And he told me about another one of his images or symbols that is the symbol, which is the shkil, again, the form, or the, as he calls it, the tabir, so the expression of the door, this was the door of his house, and is a door that replicates the story of the exit of human beings from the Garden of Eden, which is a story that exists both in the Bible and in the Quran, where the two characters there, one unable to help and the other one unable to reach, are himself and his wife. And these are, again, we see the vocabulary of the tree in these other images. So then he went on to explain to me that those paintings were special paintings. They were not the paintings that he made all the time. There are paintings that were made in a condition that was an altered state, and they contained that state. There were paintings that were both sedimentations of his illness, but also sort of images that contain the possibility of healing. And so he said they are pictures that contain a state. He said, hala is the common known medical term for a psychopathological state. It is used in the context of mental illness, as I was saying before, as well as jinn cures, spirit possession, where it designates the event of possession, and more specifically, the event of the manifestation of the invisible. It conjures, as in a semantic configuration, the idea of transformation, movement, and most important, of the idea of a passage through states. And so these are prophetic and psychotic mediation. And in the space-time of the paintings, in relation to those images, the painter is a medium. And in my work, I have reflected on this idea that he described this vocabulary of both illness and healing as a pictorial vocabulary. He sees himself as an artist. He calls himself an artist, but he says that the energy of those lines inhabit him, and they emerge in these moments of crisis, and they have a force, which is also the force of containing them. And those images are passageways. They are portals. They are not representations, but they actually descend. They emerge from another world. They are as if revelations or manifestations from a space in which reality exists in the form of image. And in saying this, he is referring to a tradition of thinking the image in Islam, according to which image is not representation, is not a portrayal of reality, is not a naturalistic copying of the external world, but it is the emergence of something that becomes perceptible as it comes and descends from the world of the invisible into, I'm sorry, I am touching the computer without realizing, from the world of the invisible, from the world of divine reality, from the world in which human existence is part of a much larger history, which is not just human, into the possibility of coming to terms with the realities through forms. And so I wanted to talk about the experience of Ilyas, because, in fact, even more than the Algerian writer, Ilyas is giving birth to dreams. But those dreams are not simply imaginative fantasies. They are not literary events, but they are something within which life and death are at stake. Those images actually represent the possibility of life in relation to an experience of death. So let me now move to the third part of my talk, where I want to bring some of these ideas and this understanding of the image as something which is not a representation, as something which is in its full uncanniness. It is actually ascending from another world, something that can be perceived by those who have feelers and eyes, ears to hear and eyes to see. So this part of my talk, which is the last part, is called Seeing, Perceiving, and Witnessing. I have known Etel Adnan since 1995 in Berkeley, Sausalito, in Marin County in California, and then in Paris and in Rabat, Morocco, where she had a past and she had many friends, and we shared the world. She has been a friend, a pole in the spiritual sense of the term, a mountain, an interlocutor, a reader, a lover of life who has always dared to confront death, violence, and distraction. She was born in Beirut in 1925 from a Syrian Muslim father who had been an officer in the Ottoman army until the army was disbanded at the end of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the World War I, and of a Greek and Christian Orthodox mother. She went to school in Beirut until she had a scholarship to pursue her study in Germany and moved to California in the mid-1950s, where she started teaching the philosophy of art at the Dominican College in San Rafael, California. And she became part of an art movement and a poetic movement, which was called the School of Perception, and that it was sort of loosely associated with the Beat generation, or the sort of the aftermath of the Beat generation. In the early 1970s, she moved back to Beirut and lived in Beirut throughout the Civil War and beyond. She came back to the US later and lived between Sausalito, California, Lebanon, and France until her death in Paris in December 2021, so only a few months ago, a few days after the closure of an important retrospective of her work as a painter of the New York Museum of Modern Art. In 2016, once that I visited her in Paris, Etel gave me the DVD of her film Motion, which was edited together in 2012, but was shot with a Super 8 camera between 1980 and 1989 in New York and Marin County, in the mode of a visual diary or a cinematic sketchbook. And it was first shown at Documenta 13 in 2012. She said to me, "It is slow, nothing happens in it. It is a sort of meditation." And she said to me to watch it at a time when I could give it concentrated attention. It was a lesson in looking, transcending any notion of ordinary space and time, a gift that remained with me as an impression, and an impression in the sense in which she herself understands perception. I watched it again on the day of her death to feel her passing through the images in her unique way of being as seeing, that special kind of witnessing that she called perceiving. The light, the water, the clouds, the buildings, and of course, the sun. The light, the water, and the clouds, the buildings, and of course the sun. Movements, scenes where she and we with her live ourselves and become that vision, that light, that water, that mountain, that sun that expands and returns to a point in the sky. A mystery of withdrawal and disclosure, a kind of showing to which she alluded in the words, sorry? Oh, we need to, yeah, but just let me finish reading one paragraph, and I will put it on, okay? So, a mystery of withdrawal and disclosure, a showing to which she alluded in the words of the 12th century Muslim mystic, Ibn Arabi. So, let me pause here for a second and show you. There is a sound, but there is a lot of noise here, so it's hard to hear. is basically no sound. And so I don't know what I was reading. So let me just reread the last 3 lines. Did you keep my PowerPoint open? Okay, good. The light, the waters, and the clouds, the buildings, and of course the sun. Moments, scenes where she and we with her leave ourselves and become that vision, that light, that water, that mountain, that sun that expands and returns to a point in the sky. I think you saw that, right? And it's done with the lens. A mystery of withdrawal and disclosure to which she alluded in the words of the 12th century Muslim mystic Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi spoke of imagination, in Arabic al-khayal, as a cosmic reality. He distinguished between 2 modes of imagination, one more familiar to us as it pertains to what we experience as our capacity to see, the fact that we can hold an image in our eyes and our mind, and we as the subject of vision. He called this mode of imagination and this faculty of seeing al-khayal al-muttasil, imagination as it is attached to the viewer, as a faculty of the viewer, something that belongs to the viewer. The second mode of imagination, however, does not require the viewer to exist. He called this al-khayal al-munfasil, the autonomous imagination, imagination as independent of the viewer and of any human perspective, where seeing is not the action of a human subject, but it is the passion of becoming world. Seeing in this second mode should be described more accurately as a kind of witnessing, and in fact in Arabic, in the writing of Ibn Arabi, it is called witnessing, al-shuhud, where the human subject, but also the non-human subject, the mountain, the stones, the fish, the water, are the witnesses of the self-disclosure of the world. In the time I have that remains here, I want to then reflect on this short segment that we saw and that she called the meditation, and reflect on the way it is related to Etel Adnan's capacity to see and to hear in the strong mystical sense of listening and seeing with the heart. We may call this witnessing, as I was saying. The way this touched me, where touching is not just a metaphor, but it is an impression, is the way in which one becomes marked by a vision. She writes in Journey to Mount Tamalpais, vision is the fainting of the eye on the subject. Perception is a laser beam which destroys in order to assimilate. It is an exchange of energies. 3 tall industrial chimneys sending white smoke into the sky, an airplane, a boat, boats, the white-gray waters of the Hudson River that shimmer into sunlight. The boats draw lines. Sailboats, Mount Tamalpais from the bay, green become blue and a vision of the night. A vision from afar and above, the sight of the condor, becoming bird. The condor is dying, she writes. The glass surface of skyscraper, giant mirrors refracting light. From close up, they morph into water. Construction sites, machines, modern mythological beings. Light and the passage in between buildings create shapes that multiply and contain worlds. Water mirrored into glass surfaces, bridges, ships, yellow and red cars filmed from above and reflected and refracted into glass building. The sea and the sky, the metallic light of the moon appearing and disappearing behind clouds, as thick as layers of gray paint. Birds flying, a cat playing, the forest, the river, the recurring pyramidal shape of Mount Tamalpais, a cosmic sign, a pole, that return in her drawings that are in fact cosmic maps. She called them motifs that transmute in the tapestry of the visual composition and return and refrain in a musical score, punctuations of sounds, sometimes echoed by fragments of a Munir Bashir's Maqam with the oud, with the lute. This is not a representation of the world, but is the world itself as a material spiritual reality. She writes in Journey to Mount Tamalpais, geographical landscapes can become spiritual concepts. A cosmic, sometimes apocalyptic landscape seen and recorded by a non-human witness, a witness from the other side of life. The motif of the sun, its ideogrammatic writing, Etel's signs, circles and squares expanding and spilling into blood-colored sky, opening and closing of the lens, the camera. My face has become the camera. The motif of the sun, a glyph and a symbol, is everywhere present in Etel Adnan's work as a life-giving and life-taking symbol. From her 1980 bookland poem, The Arab Apocalypse, which, as she tells us, began as an ode to the sun and was hijacked by the war, the Lebanese civil war, and became a reflection on creation and destruction and a mourning song for the dead. To the sun in her abstract paintings or landscapes, the sun as a red dot which spills into color and transmutes, but also retains its energetic force and its ominous echoes. The sun in the video expands into light, spills into the world, transmutes into lighter color, and then shrinks, withdrawing into a dot, a point, and taking the world with it in a movement of opening and closure, withdrawal, that resonates with the movement of cosmic transmutation. My right eye merges with color, the other gets lost in infinity. But there is no possession of colors, only the acceptance of its reality. And there is no possibility of possessing color. And if there is no possibility of possessing color, there is no possession at all. Do colors have the power to break the time barrier, she writes, and carry us into outer space? Not only those outer spaces made of miles of distances, but those of the accumulated experiences of life since the beginning and unbeginning. We're moving in our experiments towards the sacredness of images. We are understanding images to be our equals, having life and power of their own. We make them, but they are not ours. And they are not from us, which is what Elias was telling me. And I want, before I end, I want to show you, go back to my PowerPoint for a second, and sorry. What is vision? Her determinate gesture for us. Read the signs. Remember. Dhikr. Dhikr is an Arabic word that means remembrance, but also means the remembrance of death and the remembrance of God. Quote, I remember orange-colored mountains worshipped silently by dissident tribe. Learning to see, to dream, to experience, to think. As she shows in her image book, Dhikr, remembrance, which has those kind of signs. This is one of her paintings of Mount Tamalpais, of this mountain that she considers a pole, that is the place that is kind of the center of the earth and the sun. And this painting has been replicated infinite number of times in all sorts of forms, as here, or here, or here. but most often it has a red sun, which is that sun that is actually a glyph, a symbol. It is not the sun as we see it. So when she writes, she could use Arabic terms. She's an Arab poet. She speaks Arabic and writes in Arabic when she needs to, but she only writes her poetry in English and French. She could use mystical terms in Arabic, such as the term for image, symbol, revelation, manifestation, bashi, aya, ibra, bayan. But she writes in English and French because there is something about the possibility of writing in exile that makes it possible for her to produce those images. The only place where she writes in Arabic is like here, where you see the name Allah, God, written in kind of in watermark in the image. In her beautiful essay on perception, Simone Fattal speaks of those images as iconas, or we may say they are disclosures of divine existence in the world of imagination. They have something to do with resurrection. The Lebanese critic and filmmaker Jalal Tawfiq speaks of Etel Adnan as having been able to as being one of the great Arab poets and having been able to speak the dimension of apocalypse, of the present in which we live and of the present in which she grew up during the Lebanese civil war, where apocalypse is not just the destruction of the war, but is the possibility of emergence of another world. This is the cover of her book, The Arab Apocalypse, which it was published in 1980, just after the Lebanese Civil War, and that it institutes a system of symbols or ciphers or magical or mystical signs to complete sentences that cannot be completed by language, by phonetic language as we understand it. So this is the first page of the poem that we can see, which is an ode to the sun, a song to the sun that then becomes a song to the destruction of the sun through the sun as a kind of deathly intervention into the life of humans, as a way to mourn and remember the dead in the war. You see a yellow sun, a green sun, a yellow sun, a red sun, a blue sun, and then a drawing, right? A sun and then a drawing, a blue and then a drawing. And you have to stop. You cannot continue. You have to see instead of speaking in order to complete the recitation of these texts. And there are many pages of this text that are like this. And as for the sun, she says in one of, sorry, here. No, it's this one. She says, I can't find it right now, I'm sorry. Maybe it's here? No, maybe it's here. I'm sorry, I can't find it. My computer stopped working properly. So I will just tell you that she says in one of those pages of the book that she was listening to the radio and she heard that the sun has the span life of 10 million years and that the earth has already lived half of that time. So that one day the sun, that red sun that she was filming, the sun of her painting, the sun that is bearing witness to the dead of the massacres in the Lebanese Civil War, will give up its light. And here is the last page of the poem. When the sun will run its ultimate road, fire will devour beasts, plants, and stones. Fire will devour the fire, and its perfect circle. When the perfect circle will catch fire, no angel will manifest itself. Stop. The sun will extinguish the gods, the angel, and men, and it will extinguish itself in the midst of its daughters. Mother Spirit will become the night. In the night, we shall find knowledge, love, and peace. She wrote those lines after two famous massacres that happened in Lebanon, in two Palestinian camps, the refugee camps of Tal Zatar in 1976, and in the Muslim district of Karantina. And, but she evokes those events in the context of a kind of destruction in general. In the story, she cites from Babylon to the Inca Empire, to the Aztec civilization, all the way to modern colonial and post-colonial war, which are fought all the way to the moon. She says, I wanted to say son, a son, a son, through a little book, and the war came and took the poem. And so I conclude with a quote from her from the book Journey to Mount Tamalpais, in which there is a whole part in which she is attempting to tell us how to learn to inhabit our capacity for dreaming. And she says the dreams show us a higher intelligence than the intelligence that we have in everyday life. That in dreams, when we are no longer ourselves, we can dare things that we cannot dare in everyday life. The dreams remember histories that are forgotten by the people who live in their time. That her dreams remember the history of the Indian tribes that lived in this part of California and that were killed for the city of San Francisco to be built. She has visions of the mountain that she is painting and she is writing about, in which Indian people, Native Americans locked into a prison of glass, are asking to be freed from the mountains, and she wakes up in sweat, and she sees this, and there is nothing she can do other than writing the dream. And I want to conclude, I will just read that dream for a second. One October night, I dreamt that the whole mountain was made of glass, a thick greenish glass with long and rusty streaks of kelp within it. I was lying over it, looking in and discovering Indians telling me with sign language and impatient gestures that they were imprisoned for centuries. There was nothing I could do to liberate them, and a cold sweat awoke me. I had a dream which was a passage between hell and paradise. When one is happy, this river passage flows upstream. When one is sterile, it flows downward towards hell. But then sometimes one swims in the direction opposite to the current. The river goes to paradise, the swimmer to the bottom. That is the process of creation. Through the long night of the species we go on, somehow blindly, she writes, and we give a name to our need for a breakthrough. We call it the angel, or we call it art, or we call it the mountain. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a moment for a couple of question and answer.
Thank you. Hi, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I know that there was some technical difficulty, but I saw one slide where the headline was that to paint a landscape was to create a cosmic event. I don't know if I could ask you to expand upon that. Yeah, but I was wondering if you could expand upon that really quickly, because I feel like you did talk about that, you touched upon that, but maybe you could touch upon that more. I don't know.
To some extent, this is what I was trying to say through the different three parts of my paper. But Etel Adnan in particular, in the way in which he talks about perception, and I was suggesting briefly at the end that this word that she uses in English, perception, is redolent of other languages and other ways of thinking about vision, sensation, feeling, knowledge, ways that are inspired by the mystical Arabic tradition, and that in fact have to do with, in fact, what she speaks as of perception in the language of the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi, who was her greater inspirer, even though she seldom mentions him. It's almost a crypto reference in her poetry. Would be doq, taste. So the world has to be tasted, knowledge has to become me, has to impress me, has to transform me, and take me out of myself in order for me to be able to be part or be aware of the fact that my existence is part of a larger cosmic existence in which all beings partake. Trees, water, skyscrapers, cars, but also paintings. And so, in light of what I've been trying to say throughout, this is not a theory of representation. Painting is not imitation, but painting is an intervention into the nature of the cosmos that if we want to give a comparison that she wouldn't necessarily, because she is interested in this kind of across-tradition comparison. There is something shamanic about the operation of painting, of the painter, because it's a way of intervening into the cosmic maps of the world. She says, I think I read that quote from her book, that there is a mystery in the relationship between the painting, the picture, and the world, and the invisible world, but they are the same thing. So that is the sense in which painting is creating a cosmic event. You can recode the world through painting. It is a liturgical operation. This is a kind of sacred art that she's talking about, in which and in fact the stakes are stakes of life and death, she says, and I think this morning someone was reading it from the book, that perception, our capacity to keep our minds focused, is our only way to maintain a sort of a modicum of sanity in a world that is completely insane. So yeah, but this is, these are, and the resonance and their interest in the Hopi traditions, for instance, she cites in the Arab Apocalypse, Pueblo Indian stories. She refers to genocidal events both in the Middle East, but as well in the United States. And she's interested in cosmic maps, and she's actually making cosmic maps. Her last exhibition of her work, I mean, maybe there will be more, but it was at MoMA last fall. Her work was paired with the work of Kandinsky. And she writes about Kandinsky defending attacks against the geometrical use of painting in the later paintings of Kandinsky by saying that geometry is actually a cosmic geography. So there is something that the reason why I find their work so important and so important for me as well, right, is that her painting and her poetry sit on the cusp of like at the interface of creativity and distraction, so that the theory of perception, the way in which she can meditate around this mountain that is a Sufi pole at the center of the world for her, it's also the kind of concentration and capacity to exit oneself that allows one to witness a history of violence. and the history of violence, which she names violently in her poetry, particularly in the Arab Apocalypse, this idea that in order to think apocalypse as an event of disclosure, we have to be able to look at apocalypse as an event of everyday destruction, killings, murders, without the fear of confronting them, without the fear of remembering them, and sort of lending her own psychic space and her body to this operation of witnessing.
All right, that's all we have time for tonight. So let's extend another thank you. Oh, I missed you. Okay.
Sorry. Are we out of time or we have time? Okay. So the three texts that you've examined or illuminated for us. Yeah. Sorry, I just feel that the three texts you've illuminated for us, you have at once demonstrated how they're very much about the secular, but not the secular as the antithesis of the religious, but the secular as the pre-eschatological. But your own analysis is very much refusing the hegemony of the secular. So I noticed that in your analysis that the texts are about the pre-eschatological, awaiting the eschatological, but you don't give in to the appeal of the secularist frameworks that are often used to describe these.
For instance, and again, I did something a little crazy by just opposing these three works, right? That are, but I thought that at least they speak to me in a kind of powerful way, and. In the first text, I don't know if you remember, the one about the pebbles, the one about the city that is sort of sinking and disappearing and into the underground, and that it becomes a kind of mythological city, in fact. There are lots of readings of that novel. So I read the novel as a novel that attempts to generate or to give birth to a dream, which is the only way in which the violence of the history of Algeria will be witnessed, because it cannot be written in any other way. Any attempt to account for it in a documentary way through archival history, it will give us dates, it will give us names, but it will not be able to restitute the event and the immensity of what is happening. At the same time, one of the undercurrents of that text is the fact that this event of destruction is not just the Algerian war. And so Mohammed Dib, the author, who is a secular author, is an author who has never written anything about Islam, right? But is, in fact, in attempting to find a way to give birth to dreams, is meeting a tradition which is an Islamic tradition of thinking history at the encounter of mundane history, the history of this world, of everyday life, the history of not just the secular world as it was called in the context of the coming of colonial modernity, but also the world of everyday life. And it meets that history with a history of the soul, with a history of catastrophic events that are seen from the point of view of another time, from the point of view of divine histories. So, for instance, there is reference to a historical text by an Arab writer, late 14th century writer, whose name is Ibn Khaldun, who talks about the plague as an event of divine manifestation. So as an event, so as if teaching us that there are multiple layers, multiple ways in which we can read those histories. And I myself started thinking about this after the all the devastation in the Middle East that has taken place in the aftermath of the uprisings in 2012, attempting to think what does it mean from a longer span of time to look upon those events and cast them into a context that is eschatological in the sense that we're talking about events of world ending, but also a context and an in-depth analysis, just as much as also in Etel Adnan's The Arab Apocalypse. If you were to take a look and read the poem, there are scenes in which you have reenactments, so like scenes in which the world is becoming inhabited by ants, in which bugs takes the surface of the earth. There are citations from scenes of the apocalypse where we're not just talking about the war, but we're moving to another kind of level of reality in which that history can be seen in another way. And in terms of those cosmic maps, yeah.
All right, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Stefania. And a reminder that tomorrow we will have another lecture/performance in this room by Michael Tausig.